this all um, forces FDR to enact Executive Order 9066, which sort of is very infamous executive order in American history, which forced the mass internment of, um, I guess, enemies within, but really just meant Japanese Americans. Um, so, what exactly is the story behind the executive order? And also, what's the legality of it? Because to me, it seems completely unconstitutional. I mean, it is. They're taking away Japanese Americans, American citizens' guns, which is a violation of the Second Amendment. They're mass incarcerating them. There's all sorts of law violations with the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments of due process. I mean, you're taking away their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which are ideals founded in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, how how is FDR able to enact this executive order?
The excuse that they used was basically wartime security. That's it. I mean, it's a blanket statement that was given out. It's wartime security. It's national security stuff like that. But nobody knew. Was there a reason for this? Was there not a reason for this? We don't know. Um, Even through today, there's still no documented, rock solid proof or evidence of espionage or sabotage or anything like that by any ethnic Japanese person throughout the war, even leading up to it, after the war, during the war, there isn't. Um, and it was challenged. The executive order was challenged in the Supreme Court after the war, and the Supreme Court upheld the justification. So, and to this day, they still haven't. I don't believe that they've overturned it. I think it's one of the things that they haven't quite. There's yeah, there's a law. There's something in the Supreme Court. I'd have to look it up to make sure my facts are right. But there is something that occurred with the internment camps and with Japanese removal that they haven't overturned. So it's still actually they still consider it to be okay and justified. And I believe it was 9066. Um, but the order was signed on February 19th of 42. And Roosevelt actually wasn't too keen on this whole idea, mostly because he couldn't find justification for it and he didn't see the reasoning behind it. There was a couple of groups of people that were trying to find a voice, and in the end, the labor groups, the unions, and the West Coast politicians were able to be louder than anybody else that said no. And then the other issue that pushed it through was that the ethnic Japanese community didn't didn't protest. They didn't rise up and say, no, this is unfair. They didn't, that's part of their culture, right? Respect your elders, respect your government, respect your country. And to them, the United States was their country, and it is. Um, so they just essentially just let it all happen. They said, turn in your radios. So they did. Turn in your guns. So they did. At the end of the day, when they said, evacuate to this location, you're going to live here for 4 years, they said, okay. They weren't happy about it, but they felt that it was their duty as American citizens, or hopeful American citizens in the case of the Issei, that if the government wants me to do this to prove my loyalty, then I will. So on the Hill, you had, Secretary of War Henry Stimson wasn't too keen on this whole process. Saw the I don't want to say benefit of it, but saw the reasoning behind it of some people, but didn't agree with it. I would say the biggest person that I point my finger at in my research is Colonel Bendenson. He's believed to have actually written 9066. He was the liaison between General DeWitt on the West Coast, commander of the Western Forces, and Attorney General Francis Biddle. Um, he's from Washington. He is foundationally anti-Japanese. He's an isolationist. And he came up as a lawyer. He's got decades of law experience, so he was able to finagle a way to get this pushed through. Um, and with the backing of labor unions on the West Coast, agriculture groups, people that wanted to land grab the farms. The only thing that was holding him up was Secretary of Agriculture Wickard and his Food for Freedom program. He couldn't move prior to the spring harvest, I'm sorry, the winter harvest, because he would lose all those crops. They didn't have a plan on how to replace these farmers to keep the crops growing, so they needed something. So that's why I think it was delayed until February 19th. And then even then, the evacuations didn't start in full until late March, early April. And then what do they call it? The Zone 1, which was the predominantly agricultural area on the West Coast, wasn't fully evacuated and done until beginning of June. Um, and then full evacuation wasn't completed till I believe it was October of 42. So I think, he pushed it through as an executive order. They just used the excuse of wartime security. This is what we need to do. We've got too many assets in the West Coast. We've got too many rumors of fifth column activity. And then they use the excuse of, it's safer for the ethnic Japanese because we're afraid that, civilians are going to rise up and start committing crimes.
Hmm. That makes me appreciate when presidents resist sort of that warmonger pressure all the more. Because, FDR, like you mentioned, he doesn't seem too keen on it, but the pressure from everyone around him, forces him to do something like this. And for example, first one that comes to mind is JFK with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He has these warmongers around him who are pressuring him to hit that button and start war with Russia, and he resists that. And it's one of the great feats of an American president, I think, to resist that, because we could have easily gone into nuclear war with the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he resisted that warmonger pressure in his cabinet and from his advisors. And I think, when we see stuff like this where the presidents do give into that pressure, um, it highlights the times when presidents don't give into that pressure all the more. Um, you mentioned the Japanese response, and this is something that I find so admirable, is they didn't resist, they didn't protest. They sort of saw it as their price to pay as an immigrant and their price to pay to prove their loyalty to their country. I was watching a documentary and there was this little anecdote from someone talking, and they were a kid during the internment, and they asked their mom, I believe, why is this happening? Are we going to be okay? And she said, all immigrants have to pay a price, and this is just the price that we have to pay. Which I'm like, how during a time like this, when your own government is persecuting you, can you maintain that level of hope and optimism?
Right. I agree. And they did see it that way. And, there was only one camp that saw any kind of riots or any kind of, by and large disobedience, and that was Manzanar. Um, Otherwise, all of the camps were run and operated, and managed by ethnic Japanese. They set up their own communities. They set up their own community leaders. They grew their own food. They had committees. They sent people to fight in the war. When the draft came around, by and large, that's exactly what they did. They said this is what we have to do, and if someone said, well, this is wrong, then the answer was, if this is what the government wants us to do to prove our loyalty, then this is what we're doing because we're not a threat to this country, and that's what they did. I mean, how else would you get 125,000 people, 120,000 people to voluntarily go to camps? I mean, there wasn't a single incident that I could find where, you know, somebody just refused and barricaded themselves in a house. They just didn't do it.
And if you look at the video from, when they're rounding up Japanese Americans from their homes, they're all wearing suits, they have their Sunday best on. It's insane to me. The the ad just the level of civility of Japanese culture. It's mind-boggling to me that in a time like that they can still uphold their culture like that. And also, doing my research for this podcast, one of the things that was jumped out to me was just sort of the level of ignorance and barbarity of it all. Almost, I mean, these are modern times. This is what, 80 years ago. We're in modern times. Everyone's wearing suits. We have modern technology, and still people are so ignorant and don't realize that what they're doing is ridiculous. I mean, they're rounding up Japanese Americans, completely unconstitutional. It just seems so kind of barbaric.
Yeah, it is for sure, and it's something that we need not forget. I can't tell you how many people I talked to when I was doing my research. I've been studying this topic for over a decade. I've talked to people at schools and different places and talked to friends and family about this, and I can't tell, like half of them, three-quarters of them, never even knew this happened. They had no idea. They're like, "What? We didn't do that." Yeah, you did.
I mean, I don't remember learning about this in school. Yeah. I know. It's crazy. I don't remember learning about this in school. I mean, it's a darker stain on American history. I would understand why um in American schools they wouldn't want to teach people and kind of cultivate a view that America's evil, but still, like, this is a pretty big deal that needs to be known about, and it has such repercussions for today. I mean, like I mentioned earlier with the America First movement, it's so important to understand our history because a lot of the stuff that happens is still permeating in society, politics, culture today. Um, so not only were Americans at war with the Japanese, they were also at war with Germany, with Italy. Was there similar prejudice against German Americans and Italian Americans? And were the concentration camps that are so infamous and evil and known today, were they known at this point? And did that come into the conversation like, hey, this concentration camp thing might not be that good of an idea?
It did not. I think the world at large, we were not aware of the concentration camps, the death camps until I think, I think after D-Day, if I remember correctly. Um, I'd have to fact check that, but I believe it was after the Allies made some significant inroads in Europe before we started finding the death camps. So they didn't know. They didn't have any idea. So there was no ability to make a comparison at that time. Um, but the idea of internment wasn't new. Great Britain, United Kingdom, they pioneered internment camps in northern Africa in the mid to late 1800s, and then in World War One they perfected it. They interned enemies, they interned civilians, anybody that they thought that was going to be a threat to their whole democracy. Well, I guess loose democracy at that time. Um, and then they used their worldwide network of territories to ship people around the world during World War One. If their camps were full in the UK, they'd send them to Australia or India or wherever. So it wasn't a new concept. And there were also Japanese internment camps in Canada. So the United States wasn't the only people during World War II that were doing um, concentration camps. And there's a in the historical community, there's a in the world at large, there's a not an argument, but a discussion about what's the right term to use for these Japanese internment camps, because by definition, they're concentration camps. However, society as a whole throughout the world attributes concentration camps to the Nazi death camps of Europe. So, but definition wise, they are concentration camps. So I need to recognize that here and say that, like, I do understand that there's definitely a conversation of it. Are they internment camps? Are they concentration camps? By definition, technically, they're concentration camps. They're not death camps. But the death camps and the Nazi camps in Europe, yeah, we didn't have any idea about that until towards the end of the war.
Was there similar prejudice against German Americans and Italian Americans, though?
But they were limited. So there were German and Italians that were rounded up by the government, but they were minuscule. The numbers were, I think Crystal City in Texas is probably the only place that processed any Italians or Germans, I believe. Um, the scale was unbelievably small. Um, and in 1966, it wasn't written. It was just written, to protect military infrastructure and areas of sensitivity, and any time of any kind of wartime stuff. It wasn't written that it didn't say lock up all the Japanese, right? It just said make our area, make our stuff secure and hide our military secrets. In a very broad nutshell, that's what it said.
Yeah, it was sort of ambiguous. Like, hey, national security, military officials, you sort of do with that what you will.
So that did apply to any enemy that we were at war with in the World War II. But yeah, German and Italians, not even remotely close to, as much persecution. And back to what I said earlier, I have another student actually that's writing about this in their final paper. And the big argument with that is the physical characteristics of Italians and Germans as compared to, Japanese. They were readily identifiable. You walked down the street and you could absolutely, at the time, you could see someone that looked like, a Japanese person and be like, oh, they're not American. Maybe they are American because they were born here, but at the time you didn't even question it. The same with Italian and Germans. They could walk down the street. If they don't say anything, you don't know. And that's their argument. And then through my research, I read part of Henry Stimson's diary, and he said that they didn't believe that there was an issue with German and Italians in the country because the population was so low. They weren't highly concentrated in any sensitive area on the level that the ethnic Japanese were on the West Coast. And they believed that they would not be able to logistically handle a multi-coastal internment program. So they vetted the Italian and German citizens that they thought were a problem or could be a problem, and that was it.
I find that kind of hard to believe. I mean, there had to have been a lot of Italians in New York, which is probably a pretty important port city.
Yeah, and I question the concentration of Italians or Germans in Chicago, for example. So, but my student's still working on his paper. We'll see what he comes up with.
So what once they got to these internment camps, concentration camps, whatever how you want to label them, what were the conditions?
So they were bare bones. They were constructed very, very quickly. Think 2x4 frame with a barely a truss style roof, and wood siding and some tar paper on the inside. That's it. No insulation, no really foundation. Most of them were just sitting on cinder blocks. And then the biggest issue was the lack of privacy. I mean, they would have what we would consider the same size as a single wide trailer, as a barrack for these folks. And they would stick 8 families in there, and there's no division. There's no walls. There's like one stove in the corner. You don't cook in there because there's no kitchen. You have a mess hall you go to, like a military facility. Um, and they didn't give him anything. You gave him, a cot. That was it. So it was up to you to figure out how to keep warm in the winter, keep cool in the summer. If you wanted to grow some food, figure out how to get your own seeds. And we'll bring in food, and you'll cook your own food in the mess hall. We don't care about your cultural specific foods, diets, anything like that. They put them on a military style diet, more calorie counting kind of diet. Um, so it was pretty bad, and so the privacy was really bad. There was none. Um, the latrines and the showers and everything like that, they weren't segregated by male female, so you had a lot of issues of people peeking over the stalls, as it were. And that, in the Japanese culture, that's a massively big issue, because they valued their privacy, they valued their tight-knit family culture, and it was gone. And then the other part of it with the conditions was they had the family culture and all of that, but when they went into the camps, their kids stopped eating with them. They stopped having family meals because you ate in a mess hall, right? So it was like a cafeteria style, like in school. So that fell apart. Their family dynamic, their culture started to get eroded. Um, and then you had to deal with, and the camps were also located in the worst parts of the country that you can conceive of. I visited a couple of camps. One was a mache in what's called the Granada internment camp, but it's a mache in southeastern Colorado, and they have a replica bunker, or not bunker, a replica barracks there. And I toured it and I walked around it, and I'm like, this is terrible. Like, I mean, the dust is coming up through the floors, the windows aren't sealed, like you can see through the little cracks in the walls. Like, there's, again, no privacy, there's no walls, it's just a big open room. So yeah, it was pretty terrible. I mean, there's no way around it. And the assembly centers were even worse. So
That's awful. I mean, I saw that the bathrooms and the showers, they were public showers, public bathrooms. There's no sort of separation between toilets. They're all just kind of toilets lined up on the wall, public showers. But you say that they weren't even separated by sex. It was all just one big shower area.
right in the beginning, they didn't even think about it. They just gave you buildings that said, "Here's your showers, here's your latrines, have at it." So in the beginning, there wasn't any. They were like, "What's going on? I don't understand." As the camps got established, and the ethnic Japanese started to become in charge of the camps, of organization and things like that, that problem was rectified. Um, but still, they had to take turns because there was limited buildings, right? So you had one building for showers, one building for latrines, and it was like, okay, they set up schedules essentially of like who could shower when and what was going on, and all of that. So yeah, it's I don't know, it's pretty terrible. I mean, there's no nice way to say it. It was bad. It was not good.
Yeah, no, that's barbaric. I mean, I value my alone time and privacy very much. I know that's a huge aspect of Japanese culture. I can't imagine how awful that must have been. And what, they were there for 2 years, right?
So the last internment camp closed, believe it or not, it was Tule Lake, and it was March of 1946. So yeah, the camps were open. Yeah, the last camp closed in 46, which obviously we know the war
So
ended
some of
in
them were there for close to 4 years.
4 or 5 years. Yeah, yeah, 4 years. Yeah. Um, so yeah, and the government said, we're going to close the camps and you're going to be all shut down and everything's going to be great, and they didn't. So there's still a lot of questions as to why. Um, I think part of the reason is that a lot of these folks didn't have anywhere to go. They weren't welcome anywhere. Once the internment camps were shut down, once the war was over, all of that kind of stuff, um, nobody wanted them anywhere. So they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have they didn't have anything. All of their land was seized, their homes were seized, their possessions were seized and sold. Like they had nothing. They got $40 and a bus ticket, I think is what, or $10 and a bus ticket, I think is what they got.